I remember when the Phantom Menace came out. I was just a young, old man who had bought his first full-body Adidas tracksuit, and yes, it made me extremely appealing to the opposite sex. It also made me super aerodynamic. Now, I remember being wowed by this one vehicle in the Phantom Menace, and, as a professional man-boy child, I've always been fascinated by the curves of automobiles, motorcycles, planes, and of course tanks. And that Separatist armored assault tank that I saw that day gently floating above the plains of Naboo, carefully crushing the skulls of degenerate Gungans without leaving so much as an imprint in the grass, that to me, at the time, was the perfect vehicle. I really wanted it. There's something just beautiful about seeing a vehicle so large and crude like a tank being powered by something so elegant, like a repulsor lift. And the Separatist AAT was definitely really sexy to look at, but the real question is, how functional is this design actually? Well, originally the armored assault tank was commissioned by the Trade Federation. The large corporate entity had reaped the benefits of the Senate's Outer Rim-Free Trade Zone policy, and as a result, the Trade Federation was quickly building up its military power in order to stabilize its new territory and protect it from bandits and pirates. Or at least that's what the Trade Federation told the Senate, although I have to say, a main battle tank really does not belong in any security corporation's arsenal. They're usually strictly the product of a military force, and an important part of any offensive against prepared fortifications. It's basically mobile fire support, and I'm not sure if the Trade Federation really had any need for it. And these behemoths are not just like a simple speeder, they had a huge logistical tail that followed them around. The Trade Federation would commission Baktoid armor to create the AAT. Baktoid was a subsidy of the Techno Union, which would go on to provide most of the ground vehicles and droids for the Separatist cause. So let's take a look at the design philosophy behind the armored assault tank. It's a completely different mindset from what the Republic did with the ATTE, LAAT, and the ATRT. I like to combine all that into what I call the Mobile Infantry System. The average clone trooper was far more expensive than the battle droid they fought. It also took a lot more time to train them, and so the Republic greatly valued their clones. And so the majority of clones were actually deployed in mechanized units, and they were also trained to be able to use a wide assortment of vehicles for not only transport, but also to coordinate heavier weapons for fire support. The Separatists, on the other hand, were all about numbers. The B-1 battle droid was quite easy to defeat one-on-one, but there's never just one. And these low-cost clankers, well, their main job was to reveal enemy positions and suppress them, while more advanced and powerful droids or vehicles were brought into play to destroy the enemy. The AAT was one of those more powerful vehicles, and it fit well with the Separatist droid army system. But since this tank was built prior to the Clone Wars, notice how the interiors of these tanks are designed for living crew members. If you take a look at the vehicles used by the Separatists later on in the war, we see things like the Tri-Fighter, the Vulture droid, the Hellfire tank, and many other droid systems that have droid brains inside of them instead of a cockpit with controls. Now this tells us a few things. One, the AAT was most likely not designed for droids. There are no, plugs for the droids to plug in. Instead, the droids have to use physical controls like they're a living organism. Two, this also probably means that Baktoid Armor Workshop most likely intended this tank for export to the various, planetary defense forces and corporate defense forces out there that needed a main battle tank. Once the Clone Wars started in earnest, the Trade Federation and Techno Union came out as big players within the Separatist Council. It was only natural that their preferred medium tank also became an important part of the Separatist droid army's strategy. Now, before we continue, a quick word from our sponsor for today's video, Onisaber.com, the premier lightsaber manufacturer in the galaxy. None of that kyber crystal blowing up inside the hilt because the parts weren't properly assembled nonsense. Something you might get with less reputable lightsaber sellers. And this summer, Onisaber.com is giving you guys 40% off of all of their products, and that includes free shipping as well. This includes the Samurai Dual Blade setup, just in case you want to channel your inner Ahsoka Tano before her show airs. That also includes the Chimera for those who want to cosplay as Ezra Bridger cutting his way out of a space whale. Or maybe you just want to channel the chaotic energy of Chancellor Palpatine as he manipulates the Republic into engaging in the Clone Wars. All of these sabers and many more are going to be available at ownersaber.com. Please check out the description below for more information. Plus, if you guys use my promo code EWOK, that's all caps, you'll get an additional $15 off. Thank you for your patience. On to the rest of the video. Now, In this video, I want to take a look at the many pros and cons of the AAT platform to determine just like how useful this design actually is. First of all, at 9.75 meters in length, the AAT was less than half of the length of an ATTE Walker, which was around 22 meters long. Now, the size of a tank seems to matter less and less with each new generation of tanks, especially now that you have, guided anti-tank munitions. But on the battlefields of the Clone Wars, AATs are still mainly dealing with the main gun of the ATTE, which was a mass driver cannon that used line-of-sight munitions. Anti-tank missiles were used frequently by clone troopers to take out AATs, but having a small profile on your tank was still a very useful thing. Now, in previous videos, we talked about the layers of defense surrounding a TIE fighter pilot, and how shields were really just like the last layer of defense for a starfighter. A pilot's ability, their co-pilots, and their sensors' ability to detect enemies are examples of the outer layers of defense that a TIE fighter would have. The main battle tank also has many layers of defenses, the best one being dismounted infantry that can engage stealthy anti-tank crews. A tank's visibility is also really important, as we mentioned. You could put a stealth generator on your tank to hide it, or you could put baffles on the exhaust to reduce heat emissions. The Separatists didn't really do either one of these things, but that's another way you can conceal your tank. But what the AAT really relied on was its speed. Built on a heavy repulsor lift platform, this vehicle could move up to 55 kilometers per hour over relatively rough terrain. I mean, sure, it couldn't traverse the type of terrain that an ATTE could, but it was relatively quick for a vehicle of its size. One huge advantage of having a repulsor lift is that the AAT is an incredibly stable platform, even when on the move. If you take a closer look at the AAT, it even shifts back into position after it fires around from its main cannon. During the Battle of Ryloth, we see a group of AATs ambush a convoy of ATTEs. While the AATs have both the element of surprise and are in a superior position, also notice how much more accurate their fire is. Meanwhile, the ATTEs are attempting to walk and fire, which results in less than accurate shots. The ability to move and fire at the same time is the dream of every tank commander. Having a stabilized turret gun can be a huge advantage, especially in those rare tank versus tank duels. Now, the AAT didn't just survive the Clone Wars thanks to its mobility, it had other protection as well. Like with most traditional tank designs, the front hull of the AAT has an extra layer of armor more than several inches thick. This made the front so robust that droid commanders often used it as a sled to plow through walls. The tank's reactor and communications were placed in the rear of the vehicle in order to protect it. Now, the turret that houses the main gun on the AAT is very low profile and sleek. It couldn't destroy an ATTE's side armor in one shot, but repeated rounds were capable of causing great damage. Furthermore, each AAT had a payload of 57 shells, which were separated into 3 types: armor piercing, bunker busting, and general purpose high energy shells. The number of these shells is pretty average. Most standard MBTs in our own world, from the Abrams to the T-90, are loaded with roughly 50 shells. In Star Wars, larger laser cannons typically use generators to provide energy to it, but since the AAT is probably too small to house such a power plant, each individual shell houses the pressurized gases that are turned into an energy projectile for the weapon. Now, all of these shells are housed in the lower shovel-like hull of the AAT, and I think it's a pretty cool design. Whenever an AAT runs out of munitions, it just returns to its carrier, something like the C-9979. Once inside, the entire hole with the ammunition is just taken out and replaced with a hole that's already full of ammunition. This sure as hell beats the manual loading done for most modern battle tanks. I mean, imagine packing shells into your turret one at a time, just knowing in the back of your mind that it might just kill you and blow you up. Well, that's probably why the AAT has a switchable hull. You see, it's not just about making rearming a tank easier, it's also about keeping the crew compartments separate from where the ammunition is stored. That way, if the ammunition is set off, it doesn't immediately kill everyone on board. I also want to mention that the tiny size of the turret on the AAT means that it's probably pretty hard to disable it. And so even if the AAT suffers a, mobility hit to its repulsor lifts, it'll still be able to operate as a defensive turret of some kind. And of course, the whole point of the AAT is not to hunt down enemy tanks. You have all sorts of equipment that are specifically designed for that. The AAT was actually designed to support infantry attacks with its main gun, and the shovel-shaped hull also happened to be a great place for droids to ride on into battle. And this was a mutually beneficial relationship. The infantry get a ride and some fire support, and the tank gets protection from enemy sappers and anti-tank teams. Because guys, you've seen what happens to tanks when they're not supported by infantry, right? During the tank duel we see on Ryloth, the Republic quickly responds to the ambush that the Separatists carry out by unloading a bunch of AT-RTs stored within their ATTEs. The clones on the AT-RT would launch a full frontal cavalry charge against the enemy armor, and it quickly becomes apparent what the weaknesses of the AAT are. First, the anti-personnel lasers on the AAT for some reason are placed on wing-like struts you might see in an attack helicopter, and they can only really move laterally up and down. They're not even on the turret, so it's not like a coaxial machine gun found on most modern tanks, nor is there a gun emplacement for the commander at the top of the turret. This gives the AAT 4 different lasers, 2 of which are for range fighting and 2 of them are for anti-personnel work. And so without infantry support, this column of tanks here were just sitting ducks for Mace Windu's men. Mace's frontal assault, while bold, was utterly idiotic. It really should not have worked. But still, the clones were able to easily take apart the squadron of tanks, and I think this really stems back to their preparation for the war. Remember, the clones had spent 9 years getting ready for this moment. The AAT had already been studied before it took part in the Naboo invasion. The clones had an intimate understanding of how to disable this vehicle, whether it's a detonator under the turret or shooting into the rear reactor compartment with a rocket. These clones mastered it all, and clones like Captain Rex would even go on to train insurgents like Saw Gerrera how to take down a Sebi tank as well. But the fact that an AT-RT can penetrate the side armor of an AAT doesn't speak well for this platform's protection. And I assume this happens because the designers wanted to keep the weight down for this model. Yet at the same time, somehow this floating tank is still 5 kilometers per hour slower than an ATTE. There are also some other design issues with the AAT, and that includes not using the interior space efficiently. As we all know, tanks are very cramped, and the more space you have inside, the more armor plating you need on the outside. One solution the Soviets came up with was the autoloader. These have been on their tanks for more than 50 years, which is why they only have a 3-man crew in many of their tanks, gunner, driver, commander. The AAT also has an autoloader, but it also has a crew of 4 individuals. There's the driver and commander, but also 2 gunners, 1 for the main gun and 1 for the stupid laser on those side struts. I understand that this tank was originally built for organics, but why not take one of these tanks, gut it out, and replace its internal systems with something that would work with the droid? A tank's biggest weakness is the fact that it doesn't respond as quickly as other weapons platforms, and that's because the commander or the brain is separate from the driver, who is the legs, and both of them are separate from the gunner, who is the fist that attacks. Even the most experienced tank crew shouldn't be able to compete against a droid which perceives the tank as its main body. Furthermore, having the standard B-1 battle droid pilot this tank was a complete waste of this vehicle. As we all know, a weapon system is only as functional as the people piloting it. During the Battle of Al Bab in Syria, the Turkish Armed Forces fielded the Leopard 2A4 tank, one of the best tanks available on the market today. They went up against ISIS, who was armed with landmines, IEDs, RPGs, and some rudimentary anti-tank missile systems. Turkish forces lost more than 11 tanks during this engagement, and reportedly 2 Leopards were even captured by the militants. The Turkish military establishment was furious at the German manufacturers of this tank and demanded the latest upgrades be applied to this tank immediately. But the reality is, the Turkish military is probably to blame for this incident. The Turkish army failed to provide their tanks with their own infantry support and just deployed them without any cover. In their defense, they believed that the Free Syrian Army, which was more of a guerrilla force anyway, would provide infantry support with their tanks. But that's not what happened. All of the destroyed Leopard 2s were isolated when they were attacked, and the crews failed to suppress enemy anti-tank positions once under fire, or use smoke to conceal themselves and withdraw. And it's not just the Leopard 2 getting hosed. I mean, the Saudis have lost a lot of M1 Abrams tanks, and we all know how great those are supposed to be, and they lost them to the Houthi rebels, who are also not very well equipped. The point is, it doesn't matter if you have the most state-of-the-art weapons in the world. If you don't have practice using them or have a learning culture in your military, then you're going to struggle. Anything can happen on a battlefield if one side is not properly prepared. I mean, the Death Star was taken down by a single X-Wing, right? And the Separatist battle droids used to pilot the armored assault tank, well, they can hardly carry a blaster rifle and engage the enemy. Why do we assume that they'd be any better at operating a very complex war machine? That alone, unfortunately, makes me severely question the effectiveness of this AAT. I mean, remember when the Bad Batch were able to connect 3 of these tanks together and then just push them all off a cliff? And there are other more technical concerns with the AAT's design. Now, this vehicle might have a separate hull for its munitions, but that hull is not properly protected against explosions that come from below. And so while the AAT had terrific protection for its munitions from incoming fire, if it ran over a landmine, suddenly it's in league with the T-72 when it comes to turret-tossing abilities. The armored assault tank was also surprisingly not well shielded against electromagnetic pulse grenades, which again points to the fact that this tank was clearly designed for organics. Also, while the AAT only had a 10-meter length, it had a relatively tall turret that was narrow but a bit easier to hit from the side profile, which again was lightly armored. The entire shape actually reminds me of an old Mi-24 attack chopper. Also, the AAT has a rear ramp, which is where the driver and gunner can get out. It's really quite large and something you would usually see in an infantry fighting vehicle or an APC or some other kind of mechanized troop transport where unloading needs to be done rapidly. See, when you put a ramp like this on a tank, it becomes a very obvious weak spot for the enemy to hit. The Israeli super tank known as the Merkava series is well known as one of the most protected tanks in the world. But the Merkava also had a ramp in the back of the vehicle, and that's because the tank could also carry 6 infantry soldiers in addition to its tank crew. In one incident, Palestinian militants were able to fire a simple RPG-7 at that back door and disable the Merkava, injuring the crew inside. Lastly, we have some very specific cons that the AAT faces. One is that because of the repulsor lift system, the tank can't use deflector shields or drive through deflector shields, which means that during the invasion of Naboo, the AAT tanks had to just sit outside of the Gungan battle shields and just watch the skirmish from afar until the shields went down. Also, there has been one case where a sniper was able to shoot directly into the barrel of an AAT, but, that's not really a design flaw, it's just Crosshair being a madman. And so my final analysis of the AAT is that it's a good platform, one that within a few generations of upgrades and design changes could truly become one of the best tanks in the galaxy. Unfortunately, the Separatists never had enough time. Remember guys, whether you're an organic or a droid in the Star Wars universe or in our own, the tank will always dominate the battlefield, and that is because it has a unique set of characteristics that just makes it really hard to deal with. So guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy.